On May 12th, the Kremlin announced a significant reshuffle within Vladimir Putin's cabinet. This is not abnormal at the beginning of a term in office, and indeed, his fifth inauguration had just transpired on May 7th. But when a reshuffle happens in the middle of a war, it is an open invitation for speculators everywhere to go crazy. That is why today, we will quickly cover the critical takeaways from this. Actually, you know what? We're not going to do that. No. Today is just going to be a series of rants about all of the silly online commentary that has come out of the announcement, beginning with an overview of the problem, how the Minister of Defense was fired, he wasn't, the idea that this is good news for Ukraine, that's unclear, and the error of omission, Patrushev edition, that few seemed interested in despite it possibly producing the real intrigue of the story. But we begin with the general problem here, which is that we are reverting to the silly era of Kremlinology circa the 1960s. Now, when it comes to analyzing a country's inner circle, Russia is not as nearly as opaque as a place like North Korea. But we are also not looking at a country with a media wing so open that they are free to interrogate the Easter Bunny, not to mention Korean pop groups, and a man that I am beginning to suspect is not a real soccer coach. Indeed, this is a place where key parts of the military apparatus can go missing for weeks and then resurface without any explanation, in contrast to a place where if key parts of the military apparatus go missing for days, it creates a political firestorm and endless investigations. That is to say, we are just reading the tea leaves here. So yes, something interesting is happening in the Kremlin, but anyone telling you that they know what is happening is lying to you and trying to sell you something, whereas I am just trying to sell you something. Check the video description for more information on those. Anyway, let's stick to the basic facts of what is happening, beginning with the firing of Sergei Shoigu. Now, I don't know about you, but generally when someone would get fired at companies that I have worked for, they become unemployed. Maybe, just maybe, you might get a professional handshake as you walk out of the door. But usually you are going to be left out in the cold. In contrast, longtime Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu was fired so hard that he became the head of Russia's Security Council. So he's hardly being frozen out of the government here. Given that, I really do not understand how we ended up with headlines like these. To draw a comparison, there is not quite a one-to-one match to the Russian Security Council within the US government, but it would be somewhat analogous to Biden telling Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin that he was now the National Security Advisor. Sorry, Jake Sullivan. That is, Shoigu has a different role, and you are free to have opinions on whether that is a downgrade. But the man remains employed and inside the Kremlin. And actually, this result runs contrary to what the tea leaves were telling us just a week ago. On April 24th, Deputy Minister of Defense Timur Ivanov was arrested and charged with treason for allegedly accepting bribes. Shoigu oversaw Ivanov within the ministry, and he subsequently disappeared from public view for a couple of weeks, giving the tea readers something to talk about when he finally reappeared at the inauguration. It would have been surprising to see Shoigu fall from grace, given that there are not very many people making social appearances with Putin in photo sets. Seriously, there are an endless number of these shots, and indeed, he will stay within the halls of the Kremlin. Anyway, you can see how totally different Shoigu's position is now. Here is a photo of Shoigu during the Security Council meeting on March 22nd, and here he is in the first Security Council meeting post-shuffle. See? Totally different. Next up is how this is not actually good news for Ukraine. Usually, you would see a shakeup like this as a signal that something is going wrong with Russia's war plan, and that this is a desperate attempt to fix the problem. But even if you take those premises as given, you might still want to reevaluate that conclusion. Remember, it was Shoigu who was the subject of all of those Prigozhin rants, with the allegation being that it was Shoigu's own corruption that was preventing the Wagner Group from winning the war. The thing is, if someone is bad at their job, you as the opponent should want them to stay in their position for as long as possible. In other words, cynics view Shoigu as the best Minister of Defense that Ukraine ever had. Remember, it was problems within the military staff that led to all of those miscues at the start of the war. And it was the Kremlin cleaning house at the end of 2022 that has led to the Russian resurgence within Ukraine. It is also worth noting that Shoigu's replacement in the Minister of Defense role is Andrei Belousov, who comes from a background as an economist. And in our last video, I just explained how Russia's central banker, Elvira Nabiullina, is an economist and quietly Russia's MVP of the war effort. Russia needs a macroeconomic strategy if it is going to win a long war. And to the extent that Belousov helps with that, it is not good news for Ukraine. But perhaps what is most striking about all of this is an error by omission. Very little attention is being paid to Nikolai Patrushev. Remember, Shoigu got switched to the role of Secretary of the Security Council, which would seem to suggest that the former secretary is out of a job. That person is the aforementioned Nikolai Patrushev, who was once thought to be a primary candidate to replace Putin if Putin were to ever fall ill. He was nebulously being reassigned to a position to be declared later, and sure enough, within 48 hours, he had been named an aide to the president. Unlike Shoigu's switch, that sounds like a clear downgrade for someone who has traditionally been a key player in Russian security policy. But again, this is far from a professional handshake from your boss as you have been fired from your job. And indeed, we can see how completely different this position is by comparing that same March Security Council meeting from before, with Patrushev here, to the first post-shuffle meeting. The horror. He's moved a spot. Real talk for a second. This is literally what people cared about circa the 1950s and 60s. Sadly, it really does seem like we are going back to doing that. Anyway, for whatever reason, perhaps because he was not the target of Prigozhin's Führer, Patrushev has avoided the Western limelight up until now. Nevertheless, a person going from potential Putin successor to some undefined role would seem to be the bigger story here. There does not appear to be deeper intrigue here, though, because Patrushev's son, Dmitry, was promoted to a deputy prime minister position as a part of the same announcement, even though the younger Patrushev, as formerly Minister of Agriculture, was responsible for the response to the Great Russian Egg Crisis of 2023. Apparently, no harm, no foul. But again, no one really knows what is going on here. And that foul joke was so bad that I think it is time to just end the video. Again, with those darn chicken.